Today we're incredibly fortunate to have Dr. Gormley, who in September of 2016 was inaugurated as the 13th president of Duquesne University. Dr. Gormley is a native son to Western PA. He has sent all 4 of his children to the Woodland Hills School District. Before becoming president of Duquesne, Dr. Gormley has earned acclaim as a constitutional scholar, an educator, and a published author. In conjunction with Black History Month, Dr. Gormley has agreed to facilitate a discussion on the transformative landmark case, Brown versus the Board of Education. The architect of the NAACP's legal defense to demolish Jim Crow in America, Charles Hamilton Houston, and his disciple, Thurgood Marshall. Without further ado, I give you Dr. Ken Gormley.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone, and I'd like to thank Mr. Zolnak for inviting me here today, as well as Mr. Johnson, your fabulous superintendent, Mr. Murray, your principal, and everyone who has done such a great job here at Woodland Hills. As Mr. Zolnak said, I'm here in part in my role as the new president of Duquesne University, and also because I've taught constitutional law for the past 22 years there. But my most important credential is that I'm Maddie Gormley's dad, and she said it was okay for me to come as long as I brought Dunkin' Donuts, a lot of Dunkin' Donuts. You can't have them till the end. You can't have them till the end. And Mr. Snyder confessed that really he didn't care about me. He came to check out the Dunkin' Donuts. But anyway, I also brought with me Mr. Jeff Mallory, who's standing in the back. Do you want to wave? He's the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Duquesne. It's hard to miss him because he's 6'11" and played professional basketball in Spain for a couple of years. I also brought with me Mary Ellen Solomon, one of my assistant vice presidents, sitting over here. So we're all happy to be here. We better clap for Mary Ellen. We're all happy to be here at Woody High. So first of all, let me see, how many seniors do we have? Juniors? Okay, and any freshmen and sophomores? Okay. And so since this is Black History Month, I wanted to talk about the Supreme Court's historic decision in Brown v. Board of Education from 1954, a topic I've spent a lot of my career on. First, how many of you have studied Brown v. Board of Education in one of your classes? Okay, so about half of you. So does anyone want to tell us why that case was such a big deal, why it was so important? Yes, ma'am.
The segregation of schools.
Okay, what's your name?
Mariah Smith.
Mariah. So yes, it dealt with the segregation of schools in the United States and said that segregated schools were inherently unequal, right, Mariah? And so the Constitution required the schools to become integrated. So does anyone know from either reading or watching television who was the main person responsible for Brown v. Board of Education? Does anyone know? Yes, ma'am. Thurgood Marshall. What's your name?
I'm
Aaron.
Aaron.
Aaron. Okay, so who's Thurgood Marshall, Aaron?
He was a lawyer, and he was the first African American.
Excellent. Yes, he became the first. He was a lawyer who handled this important case and then became the first African American on the U.S. Supreme Court. But there's another person who's relatively obscure, an African American lawyer named Charles Hamilton Houston, who most of the country doesn't know about. Have any of you ever heard of Charles Houston? Raise your hand if you know anything about him. Okay, a couple of you. And so I have a personal reason for wanting to make sure that Charles Houston doesn't get lost in the shuffle in American history, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit. And in a couple of minutes, I'm going to show you a video about the real story of Brown v. Board of Education, leading up, the events that really led up to it. But first I wanted to give you a little background, since many of you are now government experts, you're constitutional experts from your studies here. As you probably know, how many of you have heard of the case of Plessy v. Ferguson? Okay, so that was the case that talked about separate but equal in the United States, right? And what did separate but equal mean? Anyone want to tell us what was the whole, yes, sir, in the back.
So long as facilities were equal in quality, they could be considered, they could be segregated and still be constitutional.
Okay, what's your name?
Owen?
Owen. As a practical matter, Owen, were separate facilities equal?
No. In Brown v. Board, the courts ruled that separate facilities were inherently unequal because they raised children to believe that they were inferior to others. Okay, good, Owen. And the reality is that back in the 1800s, it was even more, it was explicit. So especially in the southern states, they passed these laws called black codes that in effect kept African Americans in a state of slavery. There was nothing equal about separate but equal. And so in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, Homer Plessy, who was the plaintiff there, lived in New Orleans, and he was 1/8 African American. Very light-skinned. A lot of people couldn't distinguish whether he was white or not. So he tries to take a seat in a railroad car, in a white railroad car in Louisiana, and is arrested for that, for defying those Jim Crow laws that required separate but equal. And you got to understand, in a lot of southern states at that time, even if you had 1/100th African American blood, you were black and you were not allowed to have the access to equal laws. So Homer Plessy took his case up to the Supreme Court. He lost, and separate but equal became the law of the United States. And I got to tell you that very few people thought it was possible to ever overturn that. Even the presidents of the United States, President Taft, President Woodrow Wilson, did nothing to prevent segregation. In fact, they helped to enforce segregation. So it wasn't the presidents, it wasn't Congress, it wasn't even the Supreme Court that tried to tackle this very clear injustice in the United States. Largely, it was a band of private citizens, most of them lawyers, most of them African-American lawyers, not all of them. And a key group was this brand new group called the NAACP. You've heard of that, right? But at that time, the National Association of Colored People, that's what it stands for, was brand new. It was based in New York City. And even they didn't think it was possible to attack separate but equal. They thought the best that they could get was to try to get things more equal, even though they were going to remain separate, because the Supreme Court at that time wasn't very sympathetic to civil rights ideas. Well, there was one person who didn't take that view, and his name was Charles Hamilton Houston, an incredible figure in American history. He had been served in the all-black U.S. Army during World War I, was a graduate of Amherst College, then went on to Harvard Law School. He was the first African-American to be an editor of the Harvard Law Review. Do you know another African-American who became editor of the Harvard Law Review? Barack Obama, that's right. So after he left his studies there, he went to Howard Law School in Washington, D.C., and he took this very non-competitive law school that they called Dummies Retreat because it was so not rigorous, and he turned it into a place that trained young men, they were all men at the time, to be great civil rights lawyers. And one of his students was Thurgood Marshall. And incidentally, I should mention that Charles Houston was the vice dean at Howard Law School. He wasn't allowed to be dean because he wasn't white. So there was a white gentleman named Fenton Booth who was technically the dean, but Charles Houston ran the whole place. And he began handling cases for the NAACP at this time. And he would tag along, bring his students with him, bring Thurgood Marshall and others to carry his bag, to work on his little trials, free of charge. He didn't have any money. There was no budget.
And he developed a strategy. And this is the part that usually isn't talked about in history. It was brilliant, and it was very tricky, actually. He came at this plan of trying to hit judges with the toughest cases that would be hardest for them to resist and work his way backward. And so he did not start with cases having to do with grade school and high school, because Mariah, when you were talking about, you're talking about like public schools, right, like Woody High. He wasn't talking about that at all. He was going to the top of the pyramid, to graduate schools, law schools, professional schools, and then going to work his way back. So here were some of his early cases. Most people don't know about these. Pearson v. Murray from 1936, where you had this highly qualified black applicant named Donald Gaines Murray. I actually interviewed his wife at one point. He's denied admission to the University of Maryland Law School just because of his color, skin color. They said, sorry, we can't admit you because you're black, but we'll give you a scholarship to Howard Law School, all black, in Washington. And so Charlie Houston took the case. Thurgood Marshall helped him on the case. And they got a judge in Maryland to say that he had to be admitted to the white law school, which just really rocked the South when they got that decision. He also argued a case called Missouri X. Gaines v. Canada, where Mr. Gaines tried to go to school in Missouri to law school, and they said, no, we'll send you out of state to an all-black school. So in all these cases, I want you to know, Charlie Houston is still leaving separate but equal where it is, but he's trying to argue these aren't really equal. You see what I'm saying? He's still working with it, but saying the facilities aren't equal. Incidentally, the Gaines case ended up collapsing when mysteriously Mr. Gaines vanished after he had gotten the first victory in the courts. Thurgood Marshall told me when I had a chance to interview him, he believed he was murdered. So this was very dangerous business, I want you to understand. Not just for the plaintiffs in these cases, but for the lawyers who were handling these cases. Next came a case down in Texas, Sweat v. Painter, another Charlie Houston case, where he convinced a judge, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, that the University of Texas, getting admitted to that and an all-black school that was created to admit African Americans in Texas were just not the same thing. There was no way you were getting an equal education. So this is what his strategy was, with Thurgood Marshall working beside him. He was striking at discrimination in law schools, in professional schools, nursing schools, because the judges could understand really vividly that getting a legal education at University of Texas and this all-black law school that they just slapped together so that they could say they were giving someone an education were not the same thing. The judge could understand that. And then he was working his way backward to his real goal, which was to attack segregation, discrimination in every public grade school and high school in the United States. And that was the brilliance of his strategy. So 2 years before Thurgood Marshall died, I became interested in this Charlie Houston fellow. I read a book called Unequal Justice that talked about him. And so I wrote to Justice Marshall in Washington. I was just a young lawyer here in Pittsburgh. He didn't know me from anyone. He rarely granted interviews, and I asked him if he would consider meeting with me to talk about Charlie Houston. And he was 82 at this time, and again, didn't come out of the Supreme Court that much. I get a letter back on Supreme Court stationery that said, if I want to talk about Charles Houston, I can meet with him, let him know the next time I'm going to be in Washington. So I called up that day, got a train to Washington, and I was there in a week. And it was exactly 27 years ago. I was looking last month. It was January of 1990, long before you guys were born. But Justice Marshall, I'll never forget it, he was sitting there in his Supreme Court chambers, and by this time he had 2 hearing aids, so he was largely deaf. He had 2 canes, he had trouble walking, and he took me over to, he met me, took me over to his desk and sat down, and he opened his desk drawer and he started rummaging around and pulled out a picture. And he said, "I saved this for you. I wanted you to see what a handsome guy Charlie Houston was." But he was just devoted to this guy, and he wanted to tell the story. And he was a lot of fun, Thurgood Marshall. He was actually, used a lot of very colorful language, let's just put it that way. But he told me the story of them working together on the case. And they would drive back and forth between Howard and Baltimore, where they were doing this Donald Gaines Murray case. And he told me he had a big car that he named Betsy, and that's how he got back and forth between the places. And then he started talking about they weren't allowed to go at that time to restaurants, to regular restaurants. You had to go only to all black restaurants. And he said for dessert, Charlie would order a second steak. He said, wow, he had a real appetite. But anyway, here's a little quote from what he told me. He said, he was joking around a lot, but then he got very serious at the end. He said, Charlie was something. The interesting thing about Charlie was in the school desegregation case. That's Brown v. Board of Education. I sat right out there in the well, right out here in the Supreme Court, waiting for my oral argument. And I remember I looked around at all the lawyers present in the whole Supreme Courtroom, from the NAACP, from all across the country who had worked on this case. And I realized there wasn't a single one of them who hadn't been touched by Charlie Houston, either taught by him, or friendly with him, or guided in their careers by him. Every one of them, including me. The school desegregation case was really Charlie's victory. He just never got a chance to see it. So that's what really led to Brown v. Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall argued it. Charlie Houston never had a chance to see it. He suffered a heart attack from the crush of work going all over the country trying to press these cases. And he died in 1950, 4 years before Brown, at the age of 54. So he never got to see the culmination of his work. So today, I wanted to show you this little film that I produced for a program at Duquesne that celebrated the 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education. It was one of the biggest programs in the country. It was broadcast on C-SPAN television. They still show it a couple of times a year. One of the most touching things for me about this program was that it was the first time that the sons of these 2 men ever met right on stage. Charles Hamilton Houston Jr., who's an historian in Baltimore, and Thurgood Marshall's son, John Marshall. That was the first time they met, and it was really touching. And so, after they came together, I redid this video. The first version, I was narrating it. In this one, I had John Marshall, Thurgood Marshall's son, introduce it, as you'll see. And the voice that you hear of the narrator is Charles Houston Jr., his son. So this is the story that I put together at that time, which is the real story of Brown v. Board of Education as told by the sons of the 2 main participants.
In 1954, my father, Thurgood Marshall, appeared in this building, the Supreme Court of the United States, to argue a case that would change the face of American history. That case was Brown v. Board of Education. The real story of the Kansas school desegregation case, now part of our nation's fabric, was nothing glamorous. My father only succeeded because of the courage of a group of school children and their parents, and the brilliant legal strategy of a man named Charles Hamilton Houston, whose contributions have never been fully credited in American history books. It was my father's lasting hope that citizens of every age and color would one day appreciate the true story of Brown v. Board of Education. Understanding history, he believed, was our only hope of avoiding the missteps of prior generations and of accomplishing new victories for those who walk in our footsteps. It is worth commemorating this landmark of American history. But Brown is not just about one Supreme Court decision in 1954. It is equally the story of America's past and of our future.
After the Civil War, the freedoms guaranteed black citizens by the newly ratified 13th and 14th Amendments never materialized. Despite the promise of equal protection of the laws for all, black codes down south and Jim Crow laws separating the races pervaded America. In 1896, a New Orleans shoemaker named Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 Negro, attempted to take a seat in a white railroad car in Louisiana and was arrested. He brought his case to the Supreme Court and lost. The 14th Amendment gave him no right to sit with whites. Plessy versus Ferguson ushered in a dark period of American constitutional history. The courts had now endorsed a new way of life, separate but equal. It applied to restaurants and water fountains, and even hospitals and cemeteries. Those who questioned the second-class place of Negroes paid a heavy price. The early 1900s became a time of renewed violence toward blacks across the United States. The Constitution offered no protection from mob violence. Separate but equal had become an integral part of American life. Few believed it could be changed, except for a lawyer named Charles Hamilton Houston, still largely unknown to American history. The first black member of the prestigious Harvard Law Review, Houston became vice dean of the all-black Howard Law School in Washington, D.C., and began training a corps of Negro law students to attack a host of discriminatory laws in the courts. Among his star students was a lanky graduate of Lincoln University named Thurgood Marshall. Houston accepted the job as special counsel to the NAACP in 1934 and began chipping away at separate but equal. His strategy? Strike at segregation at the top of the pyramid, in graduate and professional schools, where judges could most clearly understand that separate rarely constituted equal. Then ratchet backwards to his real target, the entire system of segregated education in the United States. Houston took a movie camera down south to document dramatic inequalities in educational opportunities for black children. He produced a powerful film to awaken educators and policymakers up north. With the assistance of Thurgood Marshall and other former students, he prevailed in a string of cases requiring states to admit black students to their law schools, nursing schools, and professional schools, winning unprecedented victories all the way to the Supreme Court. Charles Houston turned over his job at the NAACP to his young protege, Thurgood Marshall, but he continued to work relentlessly at laying the groundwork for a frontal assault on separate but equal, until the crush of work cut short his life in 1950 at age 54. But Houston's work did not cease. In 1951, Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP filed the Briggs case in South Carolina. This was followed by the Brown case in Kansas, then by 3 more test cases scattered across the country that challenged segregation in public education. To execute this strategy, Marshall recruited high-quality legal talent, including Robert Carter, his first assistant who served as principal brief writer, Jack Greenberg, who tried the Kansas and Delaware cases, and others who would become leading civil rights lawyers of the 20th century. These cases went all the way to the Supreme Court. During arguments, the galleries were packed. The nation watched as the entire system of segregation that had defined America since slave-owning days was thrown open to legal scrutiny. Thurgood Marshall and his team worked around the clock, resolved to change the course of history. In a surprise announcement on May 17, 1954, the new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, read his opinion from the bench, declaring that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal.
I was so thrilled. It was just like being born again. It was tremendous. And the people were coming out in the streets. They couldn't believe that we had won.
Southern states resisted the Brown decision fiercely.
All the people of the South are in favor of segregation. And Supreme Court or no Supreme Court, we are going to maintain segregated schools down in Dixie.
The charge has been made. You would have been well advised to let things move along gradually for a while, but you can't overthrow the prejudices of 300 years overnight.
You can't, or maybe you can't, override prejudice overnight. But the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, 90-odd years ago. I believe in gradualism. I also believe that 90-odd years is pretty gradual.
I personally believe if you try to go too far, too fast in laws in this delicate field that has involved the emotions of so many millions of Americans, you're making a mistake.
In Little Rock, the school board selected 9 black children with excellent grades to attend the public Central High School. President Eisenhower reluctantly sent in the National Guard to maintain order.
Well, we consider this case important as one of the segregation cases, but in addition to the fact that this one involves the appearance of the National Guard on the scene, and for the first time in any of our cases, it's the action of the governor that eventually will have to be brought into court.
Across the country, resistance to Brown mounted.
Troops are sent into Virginia. They will patrol empty schoolhouses.
In Prince Edward County, Virginia, the public schools were shut down for 5 years to keep blacks out while whites were given scholarships to private academies. After the election of President John F. Kennedy, Southern governors personally blocked black students from attending their public universities. Alabama Governor George Wallace stood in the path of Negro students until Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy dispatched Deputy Attorney General Nick Katzenbach to the University of Alabama campus to confront the defiant governor.
For an unequivocal assurance that you will permit these students, who after all merely want an education at the great university...
Well, now you make your statement, but we don't need you to make a speech. You make your statement.
I will make my statement, Governor. I was in the process of making my statement.
As Governor and Chief Magistrate of the state of Alabama, I deem it to be my solemn obligation and duty to stand before you, representing the rights and sovereignty of this state and its peoples.
Faced with 17,000 troops mobilized by the federal government, Governor Wallace was forced to back down. In Mississippi, Governor Ross Barnett was not daunted by confrontation.
I love Mississippi. I love her people. I'm accustomed. I love and I respect our heritage.
After bloody riots, James Meredith, a black student who sought admission to Ole Miss, was finally enrolled with federal officials at his side.
Truth shall make us free.
The schoolhouses and universities were only one battleground. The fight for equality initiated by Brown spilled over into the civil rights movement, which demanded equality in a host of public accommodations, including buses, lunch counters, hotels, and restaurants. Spurred forward by the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others. These efforts culminated in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the most important piece of civil rights legislation in the history of America. Charles Hamilton Houston, before he died in 1950, never seeing the decision in Brown versus Board of Education, never witnessing his student Thurgood Marshall become the first black justice of the United States Supreme Court, made a telling prediction. These are his own words. So far as our struggle for civil rights is concerned, the struggle for civil rights in America is won. What I am more concerned about is the fact that the Negro shall not be content simply with demanding an equal share in the existing system. It seems to me that his historical challenge is to make sure that the system which shall survive in the United States of America shall be a system that guarantees justice and freedom for everyone.
My father went on to serve as a justice here in the United States Supreme Court for 24 years, one of the highest honors that any man or woman devoted to our system of justice can achieve. But perhaps his greatest legacy remains a Kansas school case that his mentor, Charles Hamilton Houston, never had a chance to witness. The real story of Brown v. Board of Education is worth passing down to successive generations. It provides hope that America will continue to triumph as a nation, not solely due to wealth and political might, but based upon the fundamental principle that my father believed in so deeply, that all men, in the eyes of God and the eyes of the law, truly are created equal.
Well, hopefully you can see why I feel so strongly that any real discussion of Brown v. Board of Education has to involve the story of Charles Hamilton Houston. As Thurgood Marshall told me, it was really Charlie's victory. I can tell you, I believe that the reason that Thurgood Marshall met with me 27 years ago on that day in January was that he wanted to make sure that this story got preserved so that students like you who are studying American history, who are studying government, will understand that piece of the story, and that our constitutional system only works properly when people like Charles Houston and Thurgood Marshall and others give everything in their lives to ensuring equal justice for all. And incidentally, we talked about Barack Obama being the second African American to be the editor of Harvard Law Review. I can tell you that Barack Obama, when he was in law school at Harvard, viewed Charles Hamilton Houston as his role model. And so Charles Houston's work has been continuing to leave a mark and a legacy. Now, I know that some parts of the film are also disturbing, and as you saw, the resistance to Brown was fierce in the United States, especially in the South, but all over the place. And when the Supreme Court in Brown 2 said that it had to be implemented with all deliberate speed, some of you probably heard that language in that case, it took years, decades really, for anything to happen. And when I did that program at Duquesne, we had one gentleman there, Willie Shepperson, who was part of the forgotten story you saw in the video dealing with Prince Edward County in Virginia. Literally after the Brown ruling, the governor just shut down all the public schools, so black kids couldn't go to school with white kids. White parents created a fund so that their children would get scholarships to all-white private schools. And so literally they shut down the schools in Prince Edward County. People were separated from their families. People had to move to other cities like Baltimore, Detroit, Philly to just get an education, and were separated for years while this was going on. And so as you saw, it wasn't until President Kennedy's death that ironically brought the country together leading to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that finally the Justice Department of the United States was empowered to bring civil rights cases to desegregate schools across the country. So here's one question I have for you. How much progress do you think we have made as a country in the 63 years now since Brown v. Board of Education was decided? Anyone? Yes, ma'am.
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think we've made progress, but we could make more. It's just still racism in America.
Okay, what's your name?
Jane.
Okay, great. We definitely have made some progress when you look at the scenes there, right, of where we are in the United States. But is it really where we should be? There's a lot that could still be done. Did anyone else? I saw a number of other hands raised. Did anyone else want to say something about that?
I just feel that we're all people. Just because color skin shouldn't determine how like somebody perceives you.
Okay, yeah, and that's what the Constitution says, right? The 14th Amendment, incidentally, says that all people are entitled to equal protection of the laws, right? That regardless of skin color, gender, ethnicity. So now let me ask you, because Mr. Zolnak wanted to make sure I at least talked about this a little bit. Does anyone know how Woodland Hills School District came into existence? Yes.
I know, like, I've heard about the merger. I don't really know about all that happened about it, but I know the church did.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
We forced to merge.
Forced to merge by who?
State government.
By the state government? Yes. Pardon me? Yeah, so here's what actually happened. I was around at that time. I grew up in Edgewood and Swissvale, and at the time this case happened, I was actually working for a federal judge downtown, and a judge right down the hall, Judge Gerald Weber, wrote this opinion. The case is known as the Hoots case. The plaintiffs were families. It was parents of children who wanted an equal shot at education. And actually, I was looking at the cases last night. Some of the plaintiffs I knew, the parents of Terry Knight and Billy Knight. Billy Knight went on to play in the NBA. He played for the LA Lakers. They were a great family. Terry Knight went to school with me in Swissvale. But here's what happened. In 1971, so a long time ago, when you're still having these battles after Brown v. Board of Education, Allegheny County and the Board of Education of Pennsylvania create school districts in this area. They created General Braddock Area School District, which was Braddock, North Braddock, and Rankin. Then Turtle Creek School District, Turtle Creek, East Pittsburgh. Swissvale School District, Braddock Hills and Swissvale. Churchill area, which was in this building, right? This was the Churchill High School. Chalfont, Churchill, Forest Hills, Braddock Hills, and Wilkins. East Allegheny, which was East McKeesport, North Versailles, Wall, and Wilmerding. And then Edgewood School District, which was just Edgewood. And so shortly after it did that, these plaintiffs brought a lawsuit under the civil rights laws in 1971 saying that this amounted to a violation of the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Guarantee. They said this was de jure discrimination. Do any of you know what that term means?
De jure?
Pardon me?
You said de jure.
De jure, yes.
Discrimination by law.
By law, that's Latin for by law. That the state actually got involved and purposely created school districts to try to maintain racial segregation, because the school district in the General Braddock district was predominantly more economically depressed and predominantly more minority population, and these other school districts were trying to stay separate. So in 1973, a federal court finds that the parents are right and that the creation of these school districts really was intentionally designed to peel apart communities based upon race. And the judge said the only way to fix a violation like that, which involved all of these different school districts, was to have a remedy that applied to all of the school districts and bring them together. And so by 1981, there wasn't really a plan until the parents came to Judge Weber with a plan, and they proposed that the school districts of Edgewood, Churchill, Turtle Creek, Swissvale, and General Braddock, that's actually 12 municipalities, the same 12 that are represented in Woodland Hills today, would be merged together. And it was actually, the original name of the school district was just the new school district. That was the name of it. And there was a contest, and kids in the community could propose names, and the name that won was Woodland Hills. Incidentally, two of the other areas, school districts they considered merging were Steel Valley and West Mifflin. And they decided that that was too hard for transportation, getting there in buses and everything. This school district was racially diverse, it was convenient in terms of transportation, and it worked. And so there were appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court. They failed, and so this school district was created for all time. And in 2013, just a few years ago, it achieved unitary status, which means that it had finally complied with the 14th Amendment. And so the federal courts didn't have to be involved. And I should mention, too, that the lawyer who handled this case, who really spearheaded the integration of the school districts here, was a guy named R. Stanton Weddick. He went on to be one of the great judges in Allegheny County and just retired this year. And every time I see him, he says the thing he's most proud of in his career isn't being a judge, but being the lawyer who helped to make Woodland Hills School District possible. So here's a question I have for you. What do you think Charlie Houston and Thurgood Marshall would think if they were here today to see Woodland Hills School District? What do you think they'd have to say about it? Anyone?
They'd be happy about it.
Pardon me?
They'd be happy about it, but they probably wouldn't be happy with all the other stuff that happened.
Okay, they would probably be happy to see this progress, but not enough. Yes, ma'am.
I think they would be very proud. I think our school would be a good representation of the work that they put in.
Okay, what's your name?
Back.
Madison? Well, I agree with Madison. I think that this is exactly what they saw was the solution in our country. And I often think that you don't get enough credit at Woodland Hills. But I really think that increasingly this school district is going to be a model for other districts in Pennsylvania and across the country, because it is important for kids to go to school with a whole different group of people. That is the world, ladies and gentlemen. And I can tell you that having gone to school at Woodland Hills, you are going to be well equipped to enter the world in whatever you pursue. And incidentally, let me ask you, how many of you are planning to go to college? Okay, great. How many of you are planning on law school? Any of you? Okay, a few law students. We have Vince LaDawn, who graduated from Woodland Hills, and he is doing a phenomenal job at Duquesne Law School. So I brought some of my team here with me just because I wanted them to have a chance to see all of you and all of the great work you're doing. So anything that we can do at Duquesne to help to get involved at Woody High, I'm happy to do. My thanks to Mr. Zolnak, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Murray for inviting me here today, doing great programs, and thanks for coming today.